Far to the northwest of Rome, beyond the ordered farmlands and marble villas of Italy, there stretched an immense and wild country of deep forests, wide rivers, and endless plains. The Romans called this land Gaul. To them it was a place of danger and opportunity, a frontier haunted by both fear and desire. Gaul was not a single nation, but a mosaic of tribes, the Helvetii, in the alpine valleys of what is now Switzerland, the Arvernia, and Aedui in the fertile heartlands of central France, the Belgae in the north, and the seafaring Veneti who ruled the stormy coasts of Brittany. Each tribe had its own chiefs, its own councils, its own gods and customs, and they were united not by loyalty, but by endless rivalries and wars among themselves. Yet they all shared a reputation that unnerved Rome. They were tall, broad-shouldered, wild-haired warriors who hurled themselves into battle with blood-curdling cries that shook even the bravest legionary. Rome knew Gaul well and not fondly. Centuries earlier, in 390 BC, a Gallic host had descended upon Italy, smashed a Roman army at the river Allia, and marched into Rome itself. They sacked the city and set it ablaze, leaving ashes and humiliation in their wake. That memory became a scar upon the Roman soul, a wound passed down through generations. Ever since Rome looked upon the tribes of the north with a mixture of hatred, fear, and a burning desire for vengeance. The Romans swore that one day they would repay that shame in blood. By the middle of the 1st century BC, a man had risen in Rome whose ambitions matched the scale of that ancient grudge. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Born into an aristocratic but not particularly wealthy family, Caesar had climbed the treacherous ladder of Roman politics with unmatched cunning. He had allied himself with Pompey, Rome's most celebrated general, and Crassus, the richest man in the Republic, forging what became known as the First Triumvirate. With their backing, Caesar secured the governorship of several provinces along the northern frontier, Cisalpine Gaul, Illyria, and eventually Transalpine Gaul. But Caesar was not content merely to administer. He hungered for glory, for the fame that only military conquest could bestow, the fame that could propel him to stand above every rival in Rome. The opportunity came swiftly, and it came from a people called the Helvetii. Pressed by poverty, crowded valleys, and hostile neighbours, the Helvetii decided to abandon their mountain homeland. In the spring of 58 BC, an astonishing migration began. 400,000 people, men, women, children, wagons, and cattle, set out to find new land in the west. It was less an army than an entire nation on the move, a tide of humanity flowing toward Roman borders. For Caesar, this was the perfect excuse. To allow such a multitude, armed and unpredictable, to march across Roman territory would be a humiliation. To oppose them would be war, and war was precisely what Caesar wanted. He ordered the bridge over the Rhone, destroyed dug trenches, and raised fortifications to block the Helvetii from crossing. When they sought another route, Caesar pursued them with his legions, eager to turn their migration into the spark that would ignite his own career of conquest. The clash was brutal. The Helvetii warriors were fierce and courageous, charging with long swords and round shields, shouting war cries that echoed through the valleys. But they were disorganized, lacking the drilled discipline of the Roman legions. Caesar commanded his men with the precision of a master tactician. The legionaries stood in tight ranks, shields locked spears thrusting forward in deadly unison. The Gallic charges broke upon them like waves against a wall of stone. Again and again the Helvetii hurled themselves forward, and again they were repelled, cut down, and driven back. The battlefield became a place of horror. Corpses carpeted the ground. Families who had set out in hope of a new life found themselves slaughtered in droves. By Caesar's own account of the 400,000 who began the migration, scarcely 120,000 remained alive when it ended. The survivors were forced by Caesar to return to their former lands, not out of mercy, but so they would serve as a buffer against other tribes. The Helvetii, who had dreamed of a new homeland, now limped back to their ruined valleys, broken and bleeding. For Caesar it was a triumph. His first campaign in Gaul had ended with the destruction of a great tribe, and his name resounded with glory in Rome. The news raced southward, and the people of the city cheered him as a hero. Here was a commander who not only protected the Republic, but struck fear into the hearts of the barbarians. But behind the cheers lay a darker truth. Caesar had tasted blood, and he wanted more. For the tribes of Gaul, the lesson was terrifying. Rome had shown its power, and it was greater than any single tribe could withstand. The Helvetii had been crushed, not because they lacked bravery, but because Rome possessed a machine of war more disciplined and more relentless than anything Gaul had ever seen. Some tribes began to tremble and sought alliances with Caesar, hoping to survive by submission. Others burned with anger, swearing to resist, but they were disunited and suspicious of one another. And while they hesitated, Caesar was already looking beyond plotting his next move. This first victory was not just a battle. It was the opening act of a far greater drama. Caesar understood that Gaul was vast, rich, and vulnerable. Its fields could feed his legions, its gold could pay for his ambitions, and its conquest could lift him to heights no Roman had ever reached. What began as the blocking of a migration would grow into a war of annihilation, a war that would last 8 years, claim the lives of perhaps 1 million people, and forever change the fate of both Gaul and Rome. And at the centre of it all stood one man, calm, ruthless, and insatiably ambitious. Julius Caesar had begun his war, and Gaul would never be the same again. The Belgae and the Veneti challenged Caesar. The crushing of the Helvetii had sent shockwaves through Gaul, but it was only the beginning. Julius Caesar now stood at a crossroads. He had tested his legions against a migrating tribe and emerged triumphant. Yet Gaul was not a land of one people, but of many, and in the north, beyond the rivers and forests, stirred a confederation far more dangerous than the Helvetii. These were the Belgae, and they had no intention of submitting quietly to Rome. The Belgae were different from the tribes of central Gaul. They lived in the northernmost regions, where today's Belgium and parts of northern France lie a rugged land of rivers, marshes, and dense woods. They were a proud people hardened by constant war, and in many ways closer to the Germanic tribes across the Rhine than to their Gallic cousins. They had little trust for outsiders, and even less for Rome. When word reached them of Caesar's slaughter of the Helvetii, they understood what it meant. The Romans had come not to protect allies or keep peace, but to conquer. So the Belgae began to unite, summoning warriors from dozens of tribes to form an alliance the likes of which Caesar had not yet faced. Caesar, for his part, welcomed the challenge. The Belgae were numerous, perhaps the most powerful tribal coalition in Gaul. To defeat them would bring him even greater glory. In his commentaries, Caesar claimed that rumours spread that the Belgae could muster 300,000 warriors, though in truth the number was likely less. Still, even half that number would dwarf a Roman army. Caesar commanded perhaps 8 legions, disciplined and professional, but still far fewer than the combined host of the north. It was a gamble, but Caesar thrived on risk. He marched his men northward, determined to face the storm head-on. The campaign that followed was one of fire and terror. As Caesar advanced, the Belgae tribes responded with a scorched earth policy, burning their towns, destroying their grain, and denying the Roman supplies. Smoke rose in great columns across the land, blackening the sky, as whole communities sacrificed their homes to resist the invader. The Romans, burdened by hunger and uncertainty, pressed on nonetheless. Caesar manoeuvred carefully, avoiding traps striking when he saw weakness. Skirmishes flared in the forests and along rivers, and little by little the cohesion of the Belgae began to crack. A decisive clash came near the river Ain. There Caesar built a fortified camp and dared the Belgae to attack. The tribes, perhaps emboldened by their numbers, surged forward in a massed assault. The ground shook under the weight of their charge, but once again the discipline of the legions proved unbreakable. From behind walls and trenches the Romans hurled javelins and stones, cutting down the attackers before they could reach the lines. When the Belgae faltered, Caesar unleashed his cavalry, who swept around the flanks and drove them into chaos. The Gallic horde broke, scattering into the countryside, their unity shattered. One by one, the tribes of the Confederation fell away. Some surrendered outright, others retreated into their forests and swamps, hoping to resist another day. Caesar pursued relentlessly, taking hostages, imposing tribute, and demanding obedience. By the end of the campaign, the Belgae Confederation lay in ruins. Rome had once more demonstrated that courage and numbers meant little against the iron discipline of the legions, but Caesar's appetite had only grown. With the north subdued, his gaze turned west toward the sea, and the proud people who ruled it, the Veneti. Unlike the Belgae, the Veneti were masters of the ocean. Their homeland lay along the Atlantic coast in what is now Brittany, a land of windswept cliffs and tidal bays. For centuries they had dominated trade across the Channel, exchanging goods with Britain and commanding the maritime routes. They were wealthy, proud, and fiercely independent. To them, Caesar was an intruder threatening not only their lands, but their way of life. The spark came when Caesar demanded hostages, as he always did after securing a submission. The Veneti refused. Worse still, they seized Roman envoys, detaining them as prisoners. To lay hands on ambassadors was an outrage, a direct challenge to Roman authority, and Caesar could not let it pass. Thus began the campaign against the Veneti, a war unlike any Caesar had fought before. For the first time the Romans faced an enemy who held mastery not on land but at sea. The Veneti withdrew into their fortified towns, perched on rocky peninsulas protected by the tides, and only accessible when the waters receded. Their fleet of sturdy, high-sided ships built to withstand the Atlantic swells made mockery of the lighter Roman vessels. When the Romans tried to besiege their towns, the Veneti simply sailed away, resupplying from the sea. It was a war of frustration of tides and winds, where Caesar's legions, so dominant on land, found themselves powerless against the ocean. But Caesar was not easily defeated. He ordered the construction of a Roman fleet calling upon allied tribes who knew shipbuilding, and placed it under the command of Decimus Brutus, one of his most trusted officers. Slowly, painfully, the Romans learned to fight at sea. When at last the two fleets met, it was a clash of innovation against tradition. The Veneti ships towered above the Roman galleys, their thick timbers immune to ramming. But the Romans adapted, equipping their vessels with hooked poles to seize the enemy rigging. As the battle raged, they tore down the sails of the Veneti ships, leaving them helpless and exposed. Then boarding parties of legionaries swarmed over the decks, turning the naval struggle into hand-to-hand combat. One by one, the proud ships of the Veneti were captured or sunk. The victory was total, but it came with a cruelty that shocked even some Romans. Caesar, furious at the defiance and the insult of seizing his envoys, decreed that the leaders of the Veneti be executed and the entire population sold into slavery. A nation that had once ruled the waves was broken in a single season. Its people scattered, its name reduced to a warning for others. With the fall of the Veneti, Caesar had shown that not even the ocean could shield Gaul from Roman power. From the forests of the north to the stormy coasts of the west, resistance had been crushed. Yet still Gaul was not conquered. Many tribes remained restless, simmering with hatred, and beyond the Rhine lay the Germans, wild and warlike, waiting for their turn in Caesar's story. But for now, Rome's grip tightened and Caesar's star rose ever higher. He had faced the Belgae and the Veneti, two of the proudest peoples of Gaul, and both had been destroyed. His legend was growing, his legions were blooded, and the world was beginning to realize that Julius Caesar was not merely a governor on the frontier. He was a conqueror in the making, across the Rhine and the first invasion of Britain. By the summer of 55, the BC Julius Caesar's conquest in Gaul had already astonished Rome. He had shattered the Helvetii, humbled the mighty Belgae, and annihilated the seafaring Veneti. Yet his ambitions knew no limit. Each victory only sharpened his hunger for more. Now he turned his gaze beyond Gaul's borders toward lands that few Romans had ever dared to tread. To the east lay the dark forests of Germania, home to tribes whose ferocity even the Gauls feared. To the northwest, across the narrow seas, lay the mist-shrouded island of Britannia, a place of myth and rumour rich in strange people, precious metals and trade routes. If Caesar could carry Roman arms into both of these wild frontiers, he would not only secure Gaul, but inscribe his name among the greatest conquerors in history. The pretext for war arrived as if the gods themselves had delivered it. Germanic tribes, the Usipetes and the Tencteri, had crossed the Rhine, fleeing from pressure by the fierce Suebi. Numbering perhaps hundreds of thousands, they poured into Gaul in search of land. To Caesar this echoed the migration of the Helvetii 2 years before, a vast wandering people armed and restless, threatening the fragile order he was imposing. Allowing them to settle would endanger Rome's new dominion. Opposing them would bring yet another chance for glory. Caesar moved swiftly. He confronted the Germans on the west bank of the Rhine, opening negotiations. The tribes pleaded for land, offering friendship, but Caesar distrusted them. His commentaries describe them as deceitful, skilled in ambush, and impossible to bind by treaty. When Roman cavalry was attacked in a skirmish despite supposed peace talks, Caesar seized his chance. He declared the Germans had broken faith and launched a sudden attack on their encampment. What followed was less a battle than a massacre. The German warriors fought bravely, but Caesar's legions stormed their camp with ruthless efficiency. Panic spread as the Romans cut down anyone who resisted. Families fled toward the river in desperation. Men, women and children alike rushed across the Rhine, but the weight of so many people crushed rafts and clogged the fords. Thousands drowned, dragged under by the current. Caesar reported that the entire host of the Usipetes and Tencteri was destroyed. In a single day he had erased 2 tribes from the map of history, yet Caesar was not satisfied merely with their destruction. He wanted to send a message not only to Gaul, but to the Germans beyond the Rhine. The river had always been regarded as a natural boundary, a line no Roman army had crossed. To the tribes beyond it was a barrier of safety. Caesar resolved to shatter that illusion. In a feat of engineering that astounded his own men and terrified his enemies, Caesar ordered the construction of a bridge across the mighty Rhine. The river was broad, swift and treacherous, but Roman engineers set to work with astonishing speed. Piles were driven into the riverbed beams lashed together, and in only 10 days a bridge stood firm across the waters. With drums and trumpets sounding, the legions marched across their armour, gleaming in the summer sun, their standards raised high. For the first time in history, Roman soldiers set foot in the heart of Germania. Caesar did not linger long on the far side, nor did he seek to conquer the wild forests. His purpose was symbolic, to show the Germans that Rome could come to them whenever it wished, that no river or frontier could protect them. After burning villages and intimidating local tribes, he withdrew and ordered the bridge dismantled. The message was clear: Caesar had crossed the uncrossable, and the Germans would never again feel secure behind their river. But Caesar's ambition still surged beyond. Having demonstrated his power over the Germans, he now looked west toward the misty horizon where the island of Britannia lay. The Gauls often spoke of the Britons, their cousins across the sea, who sent aid in times of war and supplied warriors' horses and grain. Caesar reasoned that so long as Britain remained a haven for enemies, Gaul would never be secure. Yet in truth, the invasion of Britain was as much about spectacle as strategy. To set foot on that mysterious island unknown to most Romans would be an achievement to dazzle the people of Rome. The preparations were hasty. Caesar gathered a fleet of transport ships, many still crude and unsuitable for the harsh waters of the Channel. His legions embarked, hearts pounding as they gazed across the narrow sea. After a rough crossing, the coast of Britain emerged white cliffs rising against grey skies, with armed warriors already massing on the beaches to resist. The landing was a nightmare. The Roman ships could not run aground, forcing soldiers to leap into chest-deep water, weighed down by armour, while British chariots and warriors hurled spears from the shore. For a moment it seemed the invasion might fail before it began. Then, in an act of desperate bravery, a Roman standard-bearer of the 10th Legion leapt into the waves, shouting for his comrades to follow if they would not betray their eagle. Inspired, the legionaries surged forward, wading, swimming, stumbling through surf and blood until they reached the beach. Slowly, with shield and sword, they carved out a foothold. The Britons fell back, astonished that the Romans had forced their way ashore. Yet Britain was not Gaul. The Romans found the islanders elusive, fighting from chariots that wheeled and darted across the open fields, harassing the legions before vanishing. Supplies ran short, storms wrecked many of Caesar's ships, and the Romans struggled in unfamiliar terrain. Though skirmishes were won and hostages taken, the expedition was inconclusive. After a brief stay, Caesar withdrew his army back to Gaul, presenting the invasion to Rome not as a setback but as a triumph. He had reached Britain, fought its warriors, and returned in honour. But Caesar was not finished. The very next year, in 54 BC, he returned with a far greater force, determined to achieve more. This second invasion penetrated deeper inland, encountering tribes led by the warrior Cassivellaunus. The Britons fought fiercely, but again disunity plagued them. The Romans advanced, took captives, and imposed terms, though once more storms and supply issues forced withdrawal. Still, Caesar claimed victory. Rome had touched the edge of the known world, and Caesar's name now rang with awe across the Republic. For Gaul, however, the meaning was clear. Caesar was not merely defending Roman provinces or punishing enemies. He was pursuing conquest without limits, seeking glory beyond any frontier. He had annihilated tribes, bridged impossible rivers, and struck at lands no Roman had seen. The tribes of Gaul watched in growing dread, realizing that soon all of them would be forced to choose submit to Caesar, or resist with everything they had. The Rhine and the Channel had once been barriers. Now, thanks to Caesar, they were nothing more than stepping stones. And Gaul, caught in the middle of this storm of ambition, was about to face its darkest years. The revolt of Ambiorix and the massacre of a legion. The campaigns across the Rhine and the expeditions into Britain had given Julius Caesar new laurels of glory, but they had also stretched his armies thin. Gaul, though cowed, was restless. Tribes simmered with resentment, their sons slain, their leaders humiliated, their people enslaved. Beneath the surface of forced treaties and hostages handed over to Rome, hatred boiled. In the winter of 54 BC, it erupted in a storm of betrayal and blood. Caesar had dispersed his legions for the cold season as was customary. To sustain such massive armies required spreading them out across different regions to forage and quarter among allied or subdued tribes. One legion was sent under the command of Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta, wintering among the Eburones, a tribe dwelling in the forests and marshes of what is now Belgium. The Eburones were considered weak, surrounded by stronger neighbours, and thus thought a safe choice for a Roman garrison. Caesar himself marched back toward Italy, leaving his lieutenants to hold Gaul in his absence, but the Romans had underestimated both the cunning and the desperation of the Gauls. Among the Eburones rose a man of sharp mind and fierce will, Ambiorix. He had long been a client of Rome, bound by treaties and forced to send hostages, but his people groaned under the burden of Caesar's demands. Ambiorix himself had tasted Roman arrogance and saw in their scattered legions an opportunity to strike a blow, not just for his tribe, but for all of Gaul. He was no mere warrior. He was a strategist who understood that open battle against the legions was hopeless. Instead, he would use guile. One day, as snow clung to the branches and the cold bit through armour and cloak, Ambiorix approached the Roman camp with a small escort feigning peace. He was welcomed, for he had long played the part of ally. Speaking with practised earnestness, he wove a tale of looming disaster. A vast Germanic horde, he said, had crossed the Rhine and was descending upon the Romans. His own people had been compelled by the Germans to rise against Rome, but he personally bore no ill will and wished to save the legion from destruction. His advice was to abandon the camp at once, march quickly, and join the nearest Roman forces before the Germans arrived. Sabinus, one of the commanders, was alarmed. His nerves frayed by the isolation of winter, and the thought of being overwhelmed, he believed Ambiorix's words. Cotta, his colleague, was more cautious. He distrusted the sudden warning suspecting treachery, and argued for holding the fortified camp where they could withstand any assault until Caesar returned. The debate raged through the night, Roman officers divided between fear and prudence. At last, Sabinus's urgency prevailed. Orders were given at dawn the legion would march out. It was the decision Ambiorix had prayed for. Hidden in the forests and hills, his warriors and allies lay in wait. As the Romans filed out of their camp in a long burdened column, soldiers' baggage trains camp followers, they entered narrow defiles where the trees pressed close and the ground rose steeply on either side. There the trap was sprung. From every slope and thicket Gallic warriors erupted with howls, hurling javelins and stones crashing down upon the column. Panic spread as the baggage wagons clogged the path, and the legionaries, weighed down by gear, could not form proper battle lines. Ambiorix's men struck with savage fury, exploiting every weakness. Sabinus, overwhelmed, tried to negotiate in the midst of battle, sending envoys to Ambiorix, but they were cut down without mercy. Cotta fought valiantly, rallying his men to form defensive circles, their shields bristling like the scales of some desperate beast. All day the fighting raged, the Romans pressed tighter and tighter, exhaustion and terror gnawing at their hearts. As darkness fell, the survivors huddled together, ringed by corpses, their hopes fading. The Gauls, emboldened, renewed the assault at dawn. This time the legion collapsed. Sabinus was slain, Cotta cut down, and the soldiers hacked to pieces where they stood. Only a handful escaped to carry the dreadful news. An entire legion, perhaps 8,000 men, had been annihilated. The massacre stunned Gaul and Rome alike. For the first time, the invincible image of the legions had been shattered. Ambiorix's cunning had achieved what countless charges in open battle had failed to do. Across Gaul, the tribes stirred. If one legion could fall, perhaps Caesar himself could be driven out. Rebellion spread like wildfire, alliances forming in secret councils, war cries echoing once more through forest and plain. But Caesar was not a man to forgive such an affront. When the news reached him, he burned with rage. Abandoning his journey to Italy, he turned back, summoning his legions with relentless urgency. He moved with terrifying speed, descending upon the rebellious tribes before they could unite fully. Towns were stormed, fields burned, populations massacred. Ambiorix himself vanished into the forests, becoming a ghost among the trees, never again captured by Roman hands, but his name would live forever as the man who had struck Rome's pride. The winter of blood left its mark on all of Gaul. Caesar's reprisals were ruthless, designed to terrify, but they also revealed the vulnerability of his armies. The Gauls now knew that Rome was not invincible. Resistance, if carefully planned, could succeed. The rebellion of Ambiorix was not the end of the war, but the beginning of a wider struggle. For Caesar, the massacre of a legion was a wound to his reputation, yet also a justification for even greater campaigns. He would not rest until Gaul was fully subdued, its tribes broken, its people either enslaved or loyal to Rome. The stage was set for new revolts, greater battles and rivers of blood, and as Caesar rode north with vengeance in his heart, Gaul prepared for the storm that was about to break. The uprising of Vercingetorix and the siege of Alesia. By the year 52 BC, the land of Gaul had become a crucible of fire. Caesar's legions had marched from one end of the country to the other, crushing tribes, burning fields, enslaving families. Yet every drop of Roman blood spilled, every farm reduced to ash, every hostage taken left a scar. The massacre of a legion by Ambiorix 2 winters earlier had proven to the Gauls that Rome was not invincible. Though Caesar retaliated with ferocity, his victories came at a cost and resentment festered in every village and forest. The time was ripe for a leader who could unite the divided tribes into a single force. That leader appeared in the person of Vercingetorix, a young noble of the Arverni tribe. His name meant great king of warriors, and he lived up to it in every sense. Tall, fierce, with flowing hair and commanding eyes, he embodied both the courage of the warrior and the vision of a general. In a society fractured by rivalries and jealousies, Vercingetorix achieved the impossible. He persuaded dozens of tribes to set aside their differences and rise together against Rome. Chiefs who had once quarrelled over pastures or plunder now clasped hands in secret councils, swearing oaths by their gods to drive Caesar from their land. Vercingetorix understood that Rome's strength lay not only in its legions but in its supply chains, roads, and discipline. To fight Rome on Roman terms, pitched battles in open fields, was suicide. Instead, he crafted a new strategy, one rooted in desperation and sacrifice, scorched earth. If the Gauls could deny the Romans food, shelter, and resources, the mighty legions would wither in hunger and exhaustion. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, herds driven away. Families wept as their homes went up in flames, but Vercingetorix reminded them that such sacrifice was the only hope for freedom. Better to lose one's fields than to lose one's people to slavery. When Caesar marched his legions against the rebels, he found not a foe waiting in the open, but a wasteland stretching before him. The Gauls harassed his columns with cavalry raids, cutting down stragglers, vanishing into woods and marshes. Caesar was forced to push deeper into enemy territory with dwindling supplies, his men gnawed by hunger. Still, the Roman general pressed on, for he knew that if he retreated, all of Gaul would rise. The two forces clashed at Gergovia. The stronghold of the Arverni perched high on a hill. Vercingetorix had chosen his ground, well fortifying the heights and daring Caesar to attack. The Romans, exhausted and overconfident, launched an assault, scrambling up the slopes under a hail of missiles. For once, discipline wavered. Confusion spread among the cohorts, and the Gauls counterattacked with ferocious cries, driving the legions back down the hill. Hundreds of Romans fell, their blood staining the rocky slopes. For the first time, Caesar suffered a clear defeat. Morale faltered, and whispers spread that perhaps the Gauls could win this war after all. Yet Caesar's genius lay not in never losing, but in recovering swiftly from setbacks. He regrouped, reinforced his legions, and sought to regain the initiative. Meanwhile, Vercingetorix withdrew with his army, harrying the Romans, but avoiding annihilation. The great confrontation was yet to come. It arrived at Alesia, a fortified oppidum of the Mandubii tribe perched on a plateau encircled by rivers and hills. Vercingetorix led his army inside its walls, confident that the Roman supply lines were stretched too thin to support a prolonged siege. From Alesia, his cavalry swept across the countryside, keeping Caesar's forces under constant pressure. But Caesar, relentless and inventive, resolved to do the unthinkable: besiege the besiegers. In one of the most astonishing feats of engineering in ancient history, the Romans constructed a double ring of fortifications around Alesia. The inner line, 11 miles long, faced inward toward the town, bristling with ditches, walls, towers, and traps designed to keep the Gauls in. The outer line, 14 miles long, faced outward, prepared to repel any relief force that might come to Vercingetorix's aid. Between the two, the Romans built a death zone of pit stakes and hidden snares. It was a fortress surrounding a fortress, a cage within a cage. Inside, Alesia food dwindled. The Gauls, numbering perhaps 80,000, consumed their stores quickly. In desperation, the non-combatants, the women, children, and elderly, were driven out pleading for mercy. Caesar, cold and calculating, refused them passage. They perished between the walls, victims of starvation and despair. Within the town, the warriors endured hunger, but Vercingetorix urged them to hold on, for he knew that a great relief army was gathering outside, and indeed it was. Across Gaul tribes rallied to the call, sending tens of thousands of warriors to break the siege. Some ancient accounts put the relief force at more than 200,000 strong, though numbers may have been exaggerated. Still, it was an army vast enough to shake the earth as it marched. When they arrived, the Romans, already weary from weeks of labour, now found themselves trapped between the defenders within Alesia and the host outside. What followed was a battle of staggering intensity. Waves of Gauls hurled themselves at the outer fortifications ladders, and grappling hooks clawing at Roman walls, while within the oppidum Vercingetorix launched coordinated sorties against the inner line. Trumpets blared. War cries echoed, the clang of sword on shield filled the air. All along the hillsides, the two armies clashed in a struggle that raged from dawn until nightfall. Again and again, the outer relief force broke through, only to be driven back by Caesar's disciplined legions. At the critical moment, Caesar himself appeared on horseback, cloak crimson, against the dust, rallying his soldiers with calm authority. His presence steadied the line, and with one final counterattack, the Romans hurled the Gauls back in ruin. The relief force shattered, and demoralized, melted away into the countryside. Inside, Alesia hope died. Vercingetorix, realizing that resistance was futile, made a decision that would immortalize him. Mounting his horse clad in armor, he rode out of the gates. In silence, the Roman legions watched as he circled once around Caesar's position, then dismounted, removed his weapons, and laid them at the conqueror's feet. The king of warriors surrendered not for himself, but to spare his people from annihilation. Caesar had achieved his greatest triumph. The fall of Alesia marked the end of organized resistance in Gaul, though sporadic revolts continued. The dream of a united Gallic nation under Vercingetorix had been crushed. Rome now held Gaul in its iron grip, but the victory came at a terrible cost. The land was ravaged, its people enslaved or slaughtered, its villages reduced to ash. Hundreds of thousands were dead or sold into bondage. The courage of Vercingetorix had burned bright, but it was extinguished in the cage of Alesia. Caesar returned to Rome in triumph, his commentaries celebrating the conquest as the crowning achievement of his career. Yet behind the polished words lay a continent bathed in blood, the aftermath, Caesar's triumph, and the end of Gallic independence. The surrender of Vercingetorix at Alesia in 52 BC was a turning point, but it did not bring peace. Gaul, vast and diverse, was not a single nation, but a patchwork of tribes, each with its own leaders, ambitions and grievances. The dream of unity under Vercingetorix had flickered brilliantly and then died, but embers of resistance still smouldered across the land. For Julius Caesar, the conquest was not complete until those embers were stamped out, until Gaul was pacified, not just in name, but in reality. And so the final years of the Gallic Wars were years of brutal mopping up, marked by betrayals, desperate revolts, and merciless Roman vengeance. After Alesia, many tribes submitted, sending hostages and envoys to Caesar. Yet others, unwilling to bow, rallied what forces they could. Among them were the Carnutes, whose revolt had originally sparked the uprising of Vercingetorix, and the Bellovaci, proud warriors of northern Gaul. Caesar marched relentlessly against them, his legions fanning out across forests and plains, striking wherever resistance appeared. The Romans built fortified camps, cut roads through wilderness, and left behind blackened ruins where villages once stood. Resistance became ever more costly. One of the most stubborn outbreaks came in 51 BC, when the Xelodunum, a fortress in the south of Gaul, refused to submit. Its defenders, inspired by the legacy of Vercingetorix, believed they could hold out as Alesia had not. They stocked provisions, fortified walls, and prepared for a long siege. Caesar, unwilling to allow even a single spark of rebellion, marched personally to crush them. The siege of Xelodunum revealed once again the brilliance of Roman engineering and the ruthlessness of Caesar's will. The fortress sat on a steep hill protected by cliffs and streams. Direct assault was nearly impossible, so Caesar ordered his men to cut off the defenders' water supply. Towers were raised, ditches dug, and covered galleries advanced toward the springs at the base of the hill. Slowly, surely, the lifeblood of the fortress was severed. Thirst began to gnaw at the defenders, their courage breaking as their lips cracked and their throats burned. At last, they surrendered. Caesar's punishment was designed not merely to subdue but to terrify. He spared their lives, but in a gesture of calculated cruelty, he ordered the right hands of all who had borne arms to be cut off. Maimed and broken, the survivors were released, sent wandering through Gaul as living reminders of Rome's vengeance. No tribe could mistake the message rebellion would not be tolerated. Even as these final strongholds fell, Caesar's political position in Rome was shifting. The conquest of Gaul had brought him immense wealth legions, fiercely loyal to him, and a reputation that outshone nearly every other Roman. But it had also bred suspicion and fear among his rivals, especially Pompey and the Senate. They saw in Caesar not merely a victorious general, but a man growing dangerously powerful, perhaps too powerful for the fragile republic. In 50 BC, Caesar formally declared Gaul pacified. The land that had once been a patchwork of free tribes was now Roman territory, its people, subjects of the republic. To mark his achievements, he prepared to return to Rome in triumph. His commentaries, carefully crafted, painted the conquest as a story of disciplined justice and inevitable Roman superiority. But behind the polished Latin prose lay the stark truth Gaul had been drenched in blood. Some estimates suggest that over 1 million Gauls were killed and another million enslaved. Entire peoples were uprooted, their cultures reshaped under the shadow of Rome. The triumph itself was a spectacle unparalleled in its grandeur. When Caesar finally entered Rome, he paraded through the streets in a chariot laurel crown on his brow, the spoils of Gaul displayed for the citizens to marvel at. Wagons carried gold weapons and exotic animals taken from the far reaches of the conquered land. Prisoners of war, chieftains, warriors, nobles were dragged in chains, symbols of Rome's supremacy. Among them was Vercingetorix himself, held captive since his surrender. For years he had languished in a Roman cell awaiting this day. As the triumph reached its climax, the great Gallic leader was led before the crowds. Once a proud king, now a gaunt prisoner, he walked silently through the jeering masses, his head high, despite the humiliation. At the end of the procession he was taken aside and executed, likely by strangulation, in the Tullianum prison. Thus ended the life of the man who had dared to unite Gaul against Rome, remembered by his people as a hero, and by his enemies as a worthy foe. For Rome, the conquest of Gaul was more than a military achievement. It expanded the Republic's territory to the Atlantic Ocean, secured rich lands for settlement, and opened vast new resources of grain timber and manpower. Gaul became a foundation of Roman power for centuries, producing soldiers who would one day march in legions themselves. The blood spilled in Caesar's campaigns was not forgotten, but over generations the conquered land became Romanized, its cities rebuilt in stone, its roads tied into the great arteries of empire. For Caesar personally, the conquest was both a triumph and a burden. He had won immortal fame, but he had also made himself indispensable to his soldiers and intolerable to his rivals. When the Senate allied with Pompey demanded that he disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen, Caesar refused. He knew that without his army he would face prosecution, ruin, perhaps even death. The legions that had conquered Gaul would now march on Rome itself, setting the stage for civil war. And so, as the 50s BC drew to a close, the Gallic Wars gave way to a new conflict, the struggle for control of the Roman Republic. Caesar's victories had reshaped not only Gaul, but also the destiny of Rome. The rivers of blood spilled in the forests of the north would soon be mirrored by the bloodshed in the streets of the Eternal City. Yet in Gaul, the memory of resistance endured. The names of Vercingetorix, Ambiorix, and the countless tribes that fought and fell lived on in stories whispered around fires. Though Rome had triumphed, the spirit of the Gauls was never entirely extinguished. They had faced the mightiest army of the ancient world, and though they were defeated, their courage became legend. The conquest of Gaul was complete, but it was only the beginning of Caesar's greater story, a story that would soon shake Rome itself to its core.